All right, everyone. Welcome to our special seminar today. We are very thankful to have Daniela Domeisen from ETH Zurich to give a presentation on the role of stratosphere in subseasonal weather prediction. Just a little background on Daniela. She did her master's in physics at ETH Zurich and a PhD at MIT. Along the way, getting a master's in climate and society at Columbia University. She did postdocs at Cornell and University of Hamburg and a short stint in the private sector before taking a faculty position at Geomar in Kiel and now at ETH Zurich. Her research has focused on predictability of the Stratospheretroposphere system, Stratospheric-troposphere coupling, teleconnections, and impacts on industry and other stakeholders. She is a co-leader of the Spark DynVar project, which is focused on modeling the dynamics in the Stratosphere-troposphere system, including model biases and extreme events. And she's a member of the Spark Stratospheric Network for the Assessment of Predictability, or SNAP project, focused on the role of stratosphere-troposphere coupling and predictability. So we give a warm welcome to Daniela, and Daniela, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Nick, for the very nice introduction. So I'd like to talk about the role of the stratosphere in subseasonal weather prediction. Already said. This is part of my research is mostly dealing with the coupling between the stratosphere and the troposphere and how that relates to, can we actually make a better prediction of the weather based on what we know from the stratosphere and how the stratosphere is influencing the troposphere. So this is work I've been doing with a range of different collaborators, including my own research group, a photo of whom you see here on the title page. And they're named down here, and then there's a lot of external collaborators who've also contributed to this work. So very excited to be here, whatever, if it's morning, lunch, or evening time for any of you. For me, it's the evening, so it's great to kind of be able to talk across time zones here. And what I'd like to focus on today are two main topics. So basically, first I'd like to introduce how the stratosphere influences the troposphere. So basically, once something happens in the stratosphere, can that have an influence then further down at the surface on our weather? And then how can we actually use this potentially to make better tropospheric predictions of our weather? So I'd like to start with those two events, those two extreme events that happened just this year, early this year. The first one is a storm series that hit the UK. And there was extremely high winds and rain by several storms that hit the UK in a row. That was in February of this year. And then in January of this year, and actually before already, we had devastating wildfires in Australia. Now, what's the connection between those two extreme events? Well, one reason might be the stratosphere might have been helping for both of these events. Now, that might seem a bit far-fetched. These events are really far apart. They're really different types of events. So let's see how the stratosphere might have been helping for those two events. And for this, I'd like to go up into the stratosphere and look at the type of events that happen up there. So what you see here in this video is potential vorticity at about 30 kilometers above the Earth's surface, meaning that anything that's pink here is a rotation of the winds in an anti-clockwise direction, like this. And you see here, we're going from January 2018 going into February, and the event I want you to look for is what happened on the 12th of February 2018. So you see the vortex here is strengthening, and you can see we're getting towards this event, and there it is. So this is a so-called sudden stratospheric warming, which means that in this case, the vortex, which we have up here, so these strong winds that are circling around the polar region, that this vortex splits into two parts. The sudden stratospheric warming can also be classified if this vortex, so these very strong winds around the pole, shift far enough away from the pole, or as in this case, if we have this extreme split. So the vortex, I'm just going to show the video again. Here we see, starting in December, the vortex slowly forms into winter and then strengthens, especially at its edge. It becomes very concentrated, very strong. Here we're still in December, but as we're going into January, you can see how the vortex is really strengthening. You see these pink areas becoming more dominant and more clear. And then as we're going into February, you can see how that event then evolves. We see large waves coming in and then splitting the vortex into two parts. So this particular event was actually a pretty remarkable one, but in general, these events happen about every 2 years or so. Sometimes they can also happen in the same winter, there can be two, and then sometimes there's also several years in a row when there is no single event happening. So this was the event that happened in 2018. There was another one, for example, a year later that had slightly different characteristic, but you can clearly see how this structure here changed and the vortex then split into these two parts. If you want to know more about these events, there's just been a review paper that's in press right now where these events and their history is described. So why do we care about these events that happen about 30 kilometers above the Earth's surface here in the polar region? Now, for the 2018 event, that's actually pretty clear, because if you look at what happened at the surface right after that event, then you can see that for the Northern Europe and Eurasia, there was extreme cold, so several degrees of anomalies over an extended period of time, and anomalous warmth here over Northern Africa, and also here over parts of Asia and Middle East. And then there was warming here, for example, in Northern Canada. So this is part of the reason why we care about these events, because they tend to have a strong impact at the surface. So is this event actually representative of what usually happens after these events? So we're going to look at this and just average over all the events that we've had so far, that we had at least in the interim data set. And we're looking here at 2 meter temperature anomalies for the averaged over week 3 and week 4 after the event happened. So about 3 or 4 weeks after, we see this exact signature that we just saw for the single event. So that single event actually worked really well. It did exactly what we expected it to do. So if you average over all events, we get that same signature: cold here over Northern Eurasia, warm in Northern Canada, and then warm here down here in Northern Africa and parts of Asia. So what is the signature? This signature is actually almost exactly the negative phase of the North Atlantic Oscillation, the so-called NAO. So whenever we have a weak vortex event, or at least most of the time, when we have one of these vortex breakdowns, we get a negative signature of the NAO, meaning that we get a weakening of the Iceland low here and of the Azores high. And instead we get these cold region in Northern Europe, warm and rainy in Southern Europe, and then the opposite kind of pattern here, and we get a pretty wavy jet stream. So this is the kind of signature that goes along with these surface temperature that we observe here. So we expect that exactly this would happen, what we saw after the 2018 sudden warming event. So these 2 meter temperature anomalies here that we saw correspond exactly to what we would have expected to happen. And it also corresponds to a negative type of the NAO circulation over the North Atlantic. Now, if you look at this event a little bit more closely, and we just look at how the NAO behaved over that winter, then we can see that basically the whole winter, the NAO was positive. And then right after the sudden, or a couple of 10 days after the sudden warming event happened, we dipped into negative territory and stayed there for about a month. So this is exactly, again, what we would expect. And the interesting thing here, and what we can then use for predictability, is that the negative NAO doesn't just happen for a couple of days, but it actually happens to be more persistent, and it happens more frequently after these events. So here's a comparison. I'm going to go one back. Here's a comparison between the climatology and in terms of the persistence of how long such a negative NAO event lasts. So what we see here is how many days an NAO event lasts, and the gray bars are how long the positive NAO event lasts, and the red bars going all the way to the bottom here, so you only see the little overshoot, is how long the negative NAO lasts. Now, if this is in climatology, so basically if we just take the entire time series, and if you now look at what happens after a weak vortex event, then we see that these negative NAO events become a lot more persistent. So we see that basically after a weak vortex event, we see much more persistent NAO events. So these weather patterns that I showed you, they don't just occur, but they also become much more persistent. So if we know how the stratosphere influences the troposphere, then can we then learn something about what the stratosphere looked like in the past? Because the problem that we have is that basically for the stratosphere, we have good observations since the satellite era. And before that, observations were relatively sparse. And especially, this is especially bad for the southern hemisphere, but also for the northern hemisphere, it's much poorer. So the question is, if we know how the stratosphere influences the surface, can we then kind of extrapolate from knowing the surface to what the stratosphere did over that time? So what we looked at here is trying to estimate how often these persistent NAO events actually happened. And we have surface data for the NAO all the way back to 1850, at least. So this is the number of the persistent NAO events back to 1850. And this is the comparison to the sudden warming events. So the red line, the light red line here, shows the smoothed SSW occurrence, the sudden warming occurrence, weak vortex occurrence that we've measured, that we've actually seen during the satellite era. And the dark red line shows the sudden warming occurrence that is estimated from these persistent NAO events, just through a regression analysis. And you can see that these two lines correspond reasonably nicely with each other. So if you assume that this relationship holds all the way back to 1850, then we can extrapolate and basically extend that estimate of how many sudden warming events did we have approximately per winter all the way back to 1850, although we don't really have any stratospheric observations back then. So you can see that basically sudden warming events probably, if this relationship holds, have occurred all the way back to 1850. I'll show you in the end what we expect for the future. So we can see that probably there hasn't been much decadal variability here in the early or in the late 19th century, but then in the 20th century, there started to be a lot more variability. And in particular, here in the 90s, there was actually the lowest occurrence of such NAO persistent events. And also, we didn't observe any sudden warming events. And based on this reconstruction, it looks like this was the lowest occurrence of sudden warming events that we have ever observed. So likely there's been something happening in the 90s that changed the frequency of sudden warming events. Could be internal variability, could be internally or externally forced. This is something we're still exploring. So basically, the 1990s probably represent the most persistent absence of persistent negative NAO events, and by extension, therefore likely the longest absence of sudden warming events for more than 150 years. So going back to what that actually means for the surface, we can look at a couple of studies that looked at the actual impacts of these sudden warming events. And I showed you that temperatures are likely different after these events. And here's a study by Kolstad et al., where they compared the timing of the stratospheric event and the anomalous number of cold days that occurs afterwards. So anything here in light blue is about 50% more cold days. Anything in dark blue here is about double the number of cold days. And you can see basically all the way up to about 2 months after the event occurs, we can see this kind of signature that we would expect from the figures that we saw before. So a much higher number of cold days in a lot of these regions. And a lot of these regions are already really cold in winter, and that can lead to health problems, for example. There's been 2 recent studies by Charlton Perez et al. Who showed that there's actually a significantly increased mortality in the UK after these weak vortex events. So sudden warmings can really actually have an impact on hospitalizations and health effects for example, these cold days. So this is over land and for human health, but in addition, we can have impacts over the ocean. So over the ocean, we talk about so-called marine caldera outbreaks, which you can see here in terms of the frequency. Marine caldera outbreaks usually measured as a temperature difference between the surface and in the middle atmosphere or the middle troposphere. And you can see here that in the Norwegian and Barents Sea, we have a significant increase of marine caldera outbreaks as compared to the Labrador Sea and south of Greenland, where we have a decrease in these caldera outbreaks. So it's really these regions that have a really significant increase over other times. So why would we care about marine caldera outbreaks? These are events when often winds come from over the region with sea ice and come over the warm ocean surface, and that can then lead to these so-called polar lows. Here's an example photo from a satellite image from a polar low in the Barents Sea. Polar lows are also called Arctic hurricanes, and they basically have the same structure. They're just much smaller and they're much shorter lived, but they have an enormous power. They can destroy Arctic infrastructure. And of course, this has been a big issue also for the fishing industry, for Arctic drilling and things like that. So basically, if we are within such a caldera outbreak, we have a higher probability of such polar lows forming. Actually, they tend to really form only in these marine caldera outbreaks. So therefore, if we have an increased probability of these marine caldera outbreaks, we also have a much increased probability of these Arctic hurricanes with corresponding influence and impacts on Arctic infrastructure. So lots of impact on health and infrastructure of these sudden warmings. So if we look at, I'm going to go back to this figure of what we would actually expect. So this is when the polar vortex weakens. This is what I showed you in the video earlier. Now, what happens if the vortex instead strengthens? So if it doesn't, it's not as weak, but it's actually stronger than normal. So this is what we see. So usually instead of getting the negative NEO, which corresponds to this pattern that we see here, we get a positive NEO, and we get a jet stream that's stronger, that comes more strongly into Europe. We have a stronger polar vortex in these times, and we get the exact opposite patterns. So instead of the cold and dry in Northern Europe, we get warm and rainy weather. And in the south, we get drier weather, and we have the opposite impacts also over Eastern North America. Now, what does the surface signature actually look like for these strong vortex events? And as you might remember, we had cold before, now we have warm. So it's basically the exact opposite as you saw in the schematic before. Now, do these even happen? What happens when they do happen? So one actually very nice example, one example that was so nice that there's now a special issue on just this particular last year in the stratosphere, which was really exceptional. In February 2020, and I'm showing you this image again, we had the storm series hitting the UK, and this was associated with a very strong Arctic oscillation. And this Arctic oscillation was actually record strong that particular year. I think NOAA here might even have to update their scale here. So this was a series of storms that came with this very strong jet stream that we have during times of a strong vortex events and of a strong or of a positive NEO and a positive AO. During this time, there were several storms that basically hit the UK in almost the same place. There was lots of flooding as a result of that. You can see a satellite image here where you see several cyclones. One of them was Storm Dennis that hit the UK during that February. So a strong series of storms that was really associated with that with that particular anomaly that happened in the stratosphere. And I've shown you a couple of extreme events now. So these are just examples. There's actually a lot of extreme events that are associated with stratospheric forcing. And if you want to know more, we've just tried to consolidate them and give an overview over what these extreme events could be. Something extreme that happened in the stratosphere that at the exact same time this spring was the anomalously large ozone hole. So these are figures of the ozone mass mixing ratio from Area 5 reanalysis. And you can see that there was an extreme ozone hole, basically what we would only expect for otherwise for the southern hemisphere. This year, because the vortex was so strong, there was no real influx of ozone from lower latitudes anymore, and there was an extreme ozone hole happening as a result of that. So there are so many impacts now coming from the stratosphere. So what does that mean for the surface? Does this mean that the stratosphere just really dictates what's happening at the surface with our weather? Well, you could probably think so, at least during winter when the polar vortex is active and strong and sometimes breaks down or becomes very strong. But the problem is that we don't fully yet understand when there's a surface impact and when there isn't. So we're really still working on understanding the coupling between the stratosphere and the troposphere. This is important, as I'll show you in the second part, for predictability. So this is, again, an average over all sudden warming events. And this is exactly the response we would expect in negative NAO or northern annular mode. And this goes along with this Greenland blocking pattern usually. So we have high geopotential height anomalies here over the Greenland area, and then low geopotential height anomalies here over parts of the mid-Atlantic coming into Europe. So this is the kind of response that we really see if we average over all events, and this is kind of what we would expect. Now, we've started taking these apart because we weren't sure, because it seemed like not all of the sudden warmings actually had this very strong signature. Well, it turned out if you only take the ones that actually have a very persistent, strong negative NAO, then you get about 2/3 of these events. So if you just take the ones that really have that signature that we expect, then we get these much stronger and very clear negative NAO pattern. If you look at the remainder of the events, which are not followed by a persistent NAO or even a switch to a negative NAO, then we get this kind of pattern. It's not even really significant over the North Atlantic, but in general, it's a negative anomaly here over Northern Atlantic and a positive anomaly here. So basically, it's the exact opposite, except there's slightly more variability and also there's fewer events, so it doesn't become actually significant. So about 2/3 of the events actually have that surface impact that I just showed you with the cold in Northern Europe and the warmth in Southern Europe. And the other third does something else. Sometimes they actually do the exact opposite. So the question is, why are they doing this? And can we actually predict which ones are having which response? Because basically, if we know that the stratosphere does something particular, and we know how the troposphere reacts, and this pattern stays there for the next 1 or 2 months, then it's really easy for us to predict the weather for the next 2 months. But if 1/3 of the events do something else, then it becomes a lot more challenging to understand what the weather will vary like and what will be like in the long term. Of course, there's not always a one-to-one relationship. So if you kind of look at it the other way around, and we look at persistent negative NAO events, and if they're actually preceded by sudden warming events, then this is only true for about 25% of the cases. So it doesn't always hold again, but there seems to be a relationship. So we try to understand what are the factors for determining what the surface response will be. And there are some studies that show that the lower stratosphere is probably important for this. What we looked at in addition is, what is the troposphere's role? Like, does the troposphere actually decide for itself if it reacts to the stratospheric forcing, or does it just react when it has time? That's usually how I understand the troposphere. So we try to understand to what extent does the surface impact actually depend on the state of the troposphere at the time when the stratosphere tries to force it. So this is a very common plot that's shown in stratosphere-troposphere coupling. So basically, this is a composite of all the sudden warming events that we had. This is for era interim data here. And we're plotting here the standard deviation of geopotential height anomalies for the Atlantic sector. You saw in the figures before that basically the main impact is in the North Atlantic sector. So here we're only focusing on this area. So you can see that basically there's something happening up here in the stratosphere, and it lingers very long in the lower stratosphere, and occasionally it kind of drips down into the troposphere. This is a so-called dripping paint plot that was first done by a famous paper by Baldwin and Dunkerton in 2001. So this response that we see is pretty typical. So we asked ourselves, how does that depend on what the troposphere does at the time when the stratosphere here is trying to have an influence onto the troposphere? So we divided these events up into different weather regimes at the time of the stratospheric forcing. So basically, we divided it into 7 different weather regimes, and the important ones that we found, I'm showing here. So what you can see here, this Greenland blocking, this is the negative NAO that we already looked at. So we found that basically if the troposphere is already in a Greenland blocking regime, so if there's already a blocking high geopotential height anomalies over Greenland, then usually once the forcing comes from the stratosphere, then the troposphere is no longer able to react. And actually it goes into different regimes and it doesn't really react to what the stratosphere is kind of providing. However, if the blocking is over Europe, then you get the very much the strongest response. So basically, the signal that you see here is probably mostly made up of the European blocking events. So if there's a block over Europe at the time when the sudden warming happens, then you can expect a very strong response. And then we also looked at cyclonic regimes, such as a zonal regime, Atlantic trough, and the Scandinavian trough. These also tend to sometimes have a downward response, although much weaker than here for the European blocking events. So it seems that the troposphere might have a role in determining how we can react to a forcing from the stratosphere. So the events with a downward impact are dominated by events that show blocking over Europe, and these regimes then favor transitioning into Greenland blocking, which is kind of the response that we would expect, so like a negative NAO event. So the troposphere might have a word to say in if there's going to be a tropospheric response. So it's not just the stratosphere telling the troposphere what to do after sudden warming. Of course, as you see here, these are events with pretty small sample sizes. So of course, this has to be accounted for. So another thing that we looked at is if the North Atlantic might potentially be modulated by the Pacific, because the Pacific is obviously through the jet stream and through downstream effects modulated by the Pacific. So we looked at if there might be a connection. And again, I'm showing you all the sudden warming events that we had in our data set. And I'm showing you here both eddy kinetic energy as a measure of the storm track and zonal wind anomaly at 300 hectopascal as a measure of the jet stream. So those two, of course, are related. And you see that on average, if you average over all the sudden warming events, you get a southward shift of the jet stream. So here, stronger winds down here. The black lines are the climatology. So you see there's a southward shift of the jet stream and there's less strong winds up here. So this is, again, the response that we would expect. And again, the storm track strengthens further south and weakens further north. So if you now again divide this up into the ones that have negative NAO and a positive NAO, then we see here the response gets stronger, of course, for the negative NAO. And for the positive NAO phases, the response is exactly opposite. And again, you see this 2/3, 1/3 division between events actually having a negative NAO following the sudden warming, and about 1/3 having the exact opposite response, actually here, a poleward shift of the jet. And if you look at the storm track, we can see a similar response, again here, a southward shift for the negative NEO, but a poleward shift for the positive NEO. In addition, what we noted is that we see the exact opposite thing, the exact opposite eddy kinetic energy here in the Pacific, just along the coast of North America. And so since we know that this area is actually influencing the storm track all the way through here into the North Atlantic, this may well be one of the influences that helps determine if we end up, which kind of response we end up with over the Atlantic. So there is opposite responses in the Atlantic storm track, but they also seem to correspond to opposite precursors in the eastern North Pacific. So based on this study and the study I showed before with the North Atlantic weather regimes, it seems that the troposphere has an influence on receiving that anomaly from the stratosphere. So the stratosphere basically provides a signal, and then the troposphere tends to decide what it does with that actual signal. So I've talked a lot about the northern hemisphere. What about the southern hemisphere? Well, this is the figure I showed you for Australia's wildfires. And there has been a study by Limidal showing that this might actually be related to an early weakening of the polar vortex. They showed, and they didn't here include the year 2020 because the study was published in 2019, but they showed that whenever the vortex weakens in the southern hemisphere earlier than usual, and this is not very common in the southern hemisphere again, then there is higher maximum temperatures in eastern Australia. There's also less precipitation. And in 2019-20, in 2019 in September, we actually had a very strong vortex weakening. And that has been linked to these fires that we then saw in the fall, or in Australia would be spring of that year. So before these extreme wildfires in 2019, the stratospheric vortex really weakened exceptionally early. It was a very strong warming event. It didn't classify as a sudden stratospheric warming event like in the northern hemisphere, but it was almost as strong. And so this might be potentially linked. Of course, it wasn't the only influence, but that was one of the links. So how about the troposphere affecting the stratosphere then? So it turns out that these wildfires actually in turn also affected the stratosphere. They produced, so the smoke that was there resulted in a planetary scale blocking of solar radiation on an extent of about 1,000 kilometers. And that block was larger than any of the previously documented wildfires. And it was similar to like a moderate volcanic eruption. It even produced its own local ozone hole. So basically, the studies showed that potentially, if we have these extreme tropospheric events, that might again affect the stratosphere itself and change, for example, the stratospheric composition that we have there. We had extreme increases in, for example, water vapor, in carbon monoxide, and in aerosols up in the stratosphere. So in summary of that first part, stratospheric events can have a significant surface impact. And in total, about 2/3 of the sudden warmings have a surface, are followed by a surface impact with a typical negative NEO event, while the others do something else, sometimes the opposite, or sometimes a very weak signal. It's however unclear what causes this diversity, and we'll get back to that in the predictability section. And this diversity is likely affected by how the troposphere is preconditioned, what the Pacific does, what the North Atlantic does, and also what the lower stratosphere does. Okay, so in the second part, I'd like to talk about what is the stratosphere's influence on tropospheric predictability. Now, if you talk about predictability, I'd like to first give you a brief intro to where we currently stand, what is the weekly to monthly weather prediction skill that we actually have. Now, if you look at this figure, this is the seasonal prediction model that's currently operational at the German Weather Service. And it shows the skill that we have if we initialize the model in November and then check what happens in December, January, February, averaged over these 3 months. So in the tropics, we have very high prediction skill, not so surprisingly, because the tropics are much more predictable on these timescales. But then in the exotropics, in this region especially, we have very low predictability. And actually all of these regions that are kind of white and blue pose very interesting questions. So if we have such low predictability in these regions, we might be able to use precursors from, for example, from the stratosphere in order to solve or in order to improve the predictability in these places. So where does the stratosphere fit in? I've here plotted an overview of all the different types of prediction that we have on the different time scale, going anywhere from weather forecasts to climate projections. And I'm going to be mostly talking about this area here where we have predictability, or we're looking for predictability on timescales of weeks to months. And the stratosphere is mostly cited as coming in at timescales of several weeks to maybe months. But there's also, of course, other areas of research where the stratosphere actually can affect the surface on actually even longer timescales. But I'm going to focus now on these 2 weeks to 3 month timescales. So what we know so far is the stratosphere is more predictable than the troposphere. So maybe we should be able to use it for prediction, right? So we can see this, for example, from this figure where we plotted the predictability skill in the troposphere versus the predictability skill in the stratosphere. And you can see that in general, the stratosphere is at much longer lead times than the troposphere. These are all different models that are used from the subseasonal prediction database, the so-called S2S prediction database. So this basically includes a lot of the currently operational subseasonal prediction systems. And you can see basically they all have higher predictability in the stratosphere as compared to the troposphere. You can also see that in general they lie on this line here. So this is linearly related. But the question is this really causal? So basically, if a model has a good stratosphere, does that mean it makes a better tropospheric prediction? Or is it maybe just that models that have had time to invest into the stratosphere probably have invested a lot of time before into the troposphere itself? So it's not necessarily causal. We see this, for example, from also when looking at summer, when we wouldn't expect a strong influence from the stratosphere, basically we see the same relationship. But still, might we be able to use the stratosphere for making better predictions? So I showed you this figure before, where we look at the surface temperature signature of weak vortex events. So we're using here air interim as kind of our truth. And I'm comparing this now again to the multimodal mean of all these state-of-the-art subseasonal prediction systems. And we're here averaging again over all the weak vortex events, all the sun warming events that we had. And we're plotting the average over weeks 3 and 4 after the initialization, after the weak vortex event. So what you see is that basically the models are pretty good at representing what's happening in air interim. So we have a reasonably good model prediction of what's happening, again, averaged over all the events. If you look instead of weak vortex events at strong vortex events, we actually see a very similar picture. I mean, we see the exact opposite picture, but again, the air interim and the multimodal mean actually correspond reasonably nicely. They don't always get the intensity of the extremes, but in general, they get the same pattern. So it seems like our models are doing a pretty good job of reproducing these events, right? So the question is, this is again the average over all events, and I showed you before that not every event will have a surface impact. So how well are the models doing when we look at individual sudden stratospheric warming events or strong vortex events? So we're checking for each event now, do we actually increase the predictability, and yes or no, and to what extent, and then we average over all over all these events. So this is what we see in the lower stratosphere now at 100 hectopascal, and we're checking the northern annular mode. So basically the Arctic oscillation, so kind of the whole globe or whole hemisphere portion of the NAO. Anything that's here greater than 0 means there is higher predictability after a weak vortex events than in climatology. Anything below 0 means there's lower predictability. So in general, it seems like once we have an event in the stratosphere, we're predicting the lower stratosphere pretty well. How about the surface? There it looks a lot more difficult. Still, most of the models, except for an exception, are getting a higher predictability, but you can see the error bars have hugely increased. So basically, the models are much less sure what's happening at the surface after these events. If you look at this instead for strong vortex events, then we can still see a similar pattern here at 100 hectopascal, actually slightly lower. And at the surface, we see a slightly increased predictability. So the signal is slightly less clear at 100 hectopascal, but it's clear at the surface. So this is now the entire hemisphere, average over the entire hemisphere. So let's look at a couple of different regions. So this is the change in predictability after a weak vortex event. So again, if it's red, there's a higher predictability after, the predictability is increased after weak vortex events. If it's blue, predictability is decreased. Now, what we found is that actually Europe, the place where we would have expected the strongest impact, and also we would have expected, therefore, there to be a much improved predictability, is actually not the region where we see higher predictability. This is one thing that we're still working on trying to figure out. One reason is probably that especially this region of Europe is kind of right at the interface between the positive and the negative anomalies of the North Atlantic oscillation. And we can do the same thing for strong vortex events. This time we're getting an increased predictability over Europe, but instead we're getting a decreased predictability over North America. So although we thought it would be pretty easy once we can show that there's a downward impact, and on average, the models are doing the right thing, if you look at individual events, the models are actually not that great at making these predictions. So why is this predictability not just significantly increased? We have this strong impact. Why don't we just see that a significant increase in the predictability? We haven't fully solved this question. There's a lot of different answers for this, and we're still exploring this. One thing that we've done so far is we've looked at identifying the biases over Europe, for example, and the North Atlantic, and tried to relate them back to what happens in the stratosphere. So this is a study led by Eric Kolstad, where we looked at the error that we get and what it relates to in the stratosphere. And you can see that here, this is the model error that we get. And this looks very negative NAO light. Again, we see this blocking over Greenland, and we see this negative anomalies down here. But this is now not the actual NAO. This is the error that we have. So basically, whenever we have weak vortex, then the negative NAO is overestimated in this model. This is now in the ECMWF model. And the exact opposite happens if we have a strong vortex, so stronger wind speed here at 10 hectopascal. We see the exact opposite, and the positive NAO is actually overestimated. So it seems like the model becomes kind of overly confident once it sees that something's happening in the stratosphere, and then it seems to kind of go for that solution. But that might be just too much because, again, not all the events have that exact response. So if you go back to our plot here that I showed in terms of predictability, there's still a lot to figure out in terms of how the stratosphere impacts what's happening in the troposphere, and especially how we can actually use this for a better prediction. Now, if you look at longer time scales, and I'm just going to give you a brief overview of what we're thinking might be happening on longer time scales, because if we know how the stratosphere changes long term, we might be able to say how the troposphere changes long term. So basically, if we say sudden warmings are becoming a lot more prevalent with climate change, then that would allow us to maybe say, okay, maybe there's also a lot more colder outbreaks in the future over Northern Europe. Now, what is the actual prediction from climate change scenarios about stratosphere-troposphere coupling, and especially how the stratosphere is changing? So this is the prediction from a paper by Simpson et al., where they looked at the CMIP models and tried to understand what is really happening in the future with the polar vortex. Now, these are all the different models that we have here. And you can see in red are the models that have a stronger polar vortex in the future, and in blue are the models that have a weaker polar vortex in the future. Now you can see that basically an equal number of models are predicting the exact opposite results. And also a lot of models here in the middle are predicting there will be no change at all. So basically the stratosphere, the polar vortex might just not change in the future. So unfortunately, we don't really know what's going to happen based on our model predictions, what the stratosphere will do. And these H and L's up here, they designate high top and low top models. In general, we would expect the high top models to do a better prediction, but you can also see that basically high top models are predicting both an increase and a decrease in the strength of the polar vortex. So we really don't know what might potentially be happening in the future. So that's currently still unclear. It depends on a range of different factors that we still have to separate out. So in summary of that second part, the average downward response of sudden warming events tends to be predicted in models, but as soon as we start looking at specific cases, the models perform much more poorly, and we have to try to understand what differentiates these different events and what the models are really doing wrong in this respect. So in conclusion, the stratosphere is in general more predictable than the troposphere. I didn't show you this part, but extreme events are much more challenging to predict on beyond deterministic timescales. So the sudden warming events themselves are much more difficult to actually predict, but once they do happen, then we can see a significant impact on the surface. So we have an impact on the surface that might potentially be used for subseasonal prediction, but there's still a lot of work to do in order to understand what can we actually use for a better prediction. So the models are not yet fully able to predict this tropospheric diversity of the responses that we have to stratospheric forcing, and there might be a lot of external drivers that then that can kind of overrule the stratospheric forcing, or maybe the forcing doesn't even get down into the troposphere. So this is all from my side. Thank you very much for listening, and I'm looking forward to your questions.